My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside large offices where people speak in polite voices, send carefully worded emails, and make decisions that quietly shape other people's futures. On paper, my job title has never sounded particularly important. I've been called an operations coordinator, a project analyst, and sometimes simply support staff. The kind of role people appreciate when something goes wrong but rarely notice when everything runs smoothly. If you had asked my coworkers to describe me a few years ago, they probably would have said something like this. Sophia is reliable. Sophia is quiet. Sophia is helpful. None of those things is an insult. In fact, they sound almost like compliments, but they come with an invisible assumption that someone like me isn't the person who leads the room, not the one who makes the decisions, not the one who gets promoted, and definitely not the one people turn to when the pressure is highest. For years, I sat in meetings where ideas I'd suggested earlier somehow sounded more convincing when someone else repeated them. I watched younger employees climb faster ladders. I listened to managers describe leadership as something you could just see in certain people. Apparently, they couldn't see it in me. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Work is work. Titles are just titles. If the job was getting done, that should be enough. But time has a quiet way of revealing patterns, and eventually patterns start to say something. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with drama. There was no shouting, no big confrontation, no dramatic speech where someone finally admitted they were wrong about me. Instead, it started with a sentence my manager said during a routine performance review. A sentence that sounded harmless on the surface. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and told me, "Sophia, you're extremely dependable, but I just don't think you're leadership material." I remember nodding politely. I even thanked him for the feedback. What he didn't realize, and what no one in that office realized, was that by the time he said those words, I already understood something about the way our department worked, something most people had never noticed. And a few months later, when a crisis shut down half our operations overnight, the same people who had quietly overlooked me for years suddenly found themselves looking in my direction. Not because I asked them to, but because they had no other choice. This isn't a story about revenge, and it's not about proving anyone wrong in the loud, dramatic way people expect. It's about what happens when someone who has been underestimated for years finally stops trying to be seen and simply decides to act. Before we go further, I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a place where people underestimated you? Not because you lacked ability, but because they never really looked closely enough to see it? In most offices, people think they understand each other within the first few weeks. Not deeply, of course, but enough to assign quiet labels. Who's ambitious? Who's charismatic? Who's difficult? Who's forgettable? By the time I had been at our department for a year, I had already been assigned mine. Reliable. It sounds flattering at first. Managers say it with appreciation. Coworkers say it with relief. When a project needs organizing, when a system needs fixing, when someone else forgets a deadline, reliable people are the ones they turn to. But reliability has a strange side effect. Once people place you in that category, they stop imagining you as anything else. At Northbridge Logistics, where I worked in downtown Seattle, my desk sat near the far side of the operations floor. Not hidden exactly, but not central either. The kind of position where you could see almost everything without being directly part of the conversation. From there, I coordinated shipment reports, cross-department communication, and internal documentation. On paper, it sounded administrative. In reality, it meant I understood how the entire system functioned, which vendor contracts were fragile, which internal software tools actually worked, and which ones people pretended worked, which teams quietly depended on manual fixes that no one had officially documented. Most people didn't realize how many invisible adjustments kept the department running. And they definitely didn't realize how many of those adjustments passed through my desk. But knowledge and recognition don't always travel together. Our department had about 40 employees. Every Monday morning, we held a leadership meeting, managers, team leads, and occasionally senior analysts. I wasn't invited. That wasn't unusual. My position technically didn't require it. Still, every Monday afternoon, someone from that meeting would appear beside my desk holding a notepad and asking a question that always sounded slightly rushed. "Sophia, do you know why the shipment reconciliation numbers are different this week?" Or, "Sophia, where's that internal report from last quarter?" the one we used during the audit, or my personal favorite, Sophia, how does this process actually work? I would show them calmly, quickly, without making it complicated. Most of the time, they would nod, thank me, and hurry away to continue whatever conversation had started in that conference room earlier that day. And that was usually the end of it. No one said that Sophia should probably be in those meetings. No one suggested that the person quietly explaining how everything functioned might have something useful to say before problems appeared. Instead, they kept seeing me the same way: helpful, organized, quiet, reliable. The strange thing about being underestimated isn't that people are rude. Most of the time, they're perfectly polite. My coworkers liked me. They smiled when they passed my desk. A few of them even stopped by during lunch to chat about weekend plans or the latest office gossip. But there was a subtle boundary that never moved. They talked around me, not through me. Ideas floated above my role, decisions formed somewhere else. And by the time they reached my desk, they arrived as instructions rather than conversations. For a long time, I told myself that it was fine. Every workplace has structure. Not everyone needs to lead. But there were moments, small, almost invisible moments, when the difference became impossible to ignore. Like when a new analyst named Evan joined the team. He was friendly, energetic, and about 8 years younger than I was. Within 3 months, he was invited to the Monday leadership meetings. Not because he knew the systems better, not because he had been there longer, but because, as one manager casually said during a hallway conversation, Evan has leadership energy. I remember hearing that phrase while reviewing a logistics report at my desk. Leadership energy. I didn't say anything. I just made a small correction in the report, saved the file, and continued working. But in that quiet moment, something inside me noticed the pattern more clearly than ever. Not angrily, not dramatically, just clearly. Because when people decide who you are, they rarely revisit the decision. And at Northbridge Logistics, I had already been assigned my role. The reliable one, the quiet one, the one who kept things working in the background. At least, that's who they thought I was. The first moment most people remember being underestimated is usually dramatic. A public dismissal, a harsh comment, something sharp enough that everyone in the room notices it. But that's rarely how it actually happens. More often, it begins with something small enough that only one person really feels it. For me, it happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning. Nothing about the day suggested it would matter later. The office was moving at its usual pace, keyboards clicking, phones ringing occasionally, the soft hum of conversations drifting across the operations floor. I was reviewing shipment reconciliation reports when my manager, Daniel Mercer, stopped by my desk. Daniel had been leading our department for about 2 years. He wasn't a bad manager. In fact, most people described him as reasonable and easy to work with. But he also had a habit of making quick judgments about people. And once he made them, they rarely changed. That morning, he placed a printed spreadsheet on my desk. "Sophia, quick question," he said. "Do you know why the West Coast vendor numbers are off this week?" I glanced at the sheet. It took about 10 seconds to see the issue. "The reconciliation script didn't run Monday night," I said. "The server maintenance probably interrupted it. The raw data's correct. It just didn't get processed." Daniel nodded slowly. "Right, okay." Then he paused. "You know," he added casually, "Evan actually mentioned something similar earlier." I looked up. "Did he?" I asked. "Yeah," Daniel said, and he's starting to think more like a systems person. "That's the kind of initiative we like to see." He tapped the paper lightly on my desk. "Anyway, can you fix the report before the afternoon meeting?" "Of course," I said. And that was the entire interaction. No insult, no raised voice. No one nearby would have thought anything about it. But as Daniel walked away, something about that exchange stayed with me. Not because Evan had mentioned the problem first. That part didn't bother me. What stayed with me was the assumption built into the conversation. Daniel hadn't come to ask my opinion as someone who understood the system. He had come because something needed fixing. Evan, meanwhile, had been praised for simply noticing the issue. I spent the next 20 minutes correcting the report. It was a straightforward adjustment, running the missed script, verifying the processed numbers, and updating the file before the afternoon meeting. When I finished, I emailed the corrected version to Daniel. A few hours later, I passed the conference room where the leadership meeting was happening. Through the glass wall, I could see Daniel presenting the updated report. Evan was seated at the table. I kept walking. Later that afternoon, Evan stopped by my desk. "Hey, Sophia," he said with an easy smile. "Daniel said you figured out the report issue." "Just a processing error," I replied. "Yeah," he said. "I had a feeling it might be something like that." He sounded pleased with himself, not arrogantly, just confidently. And I realized something interesting in that moment. Evan genuinely believed he had contributed to solving the problem, not because he had taken credit, but because the structure of the office had quietly told him he belonged in that conversation, while I belonged somewhere else. I nodded politely and returned to my work after he left. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but internally, I had started paying closer attention, because sometimes the first small cut isn't painful enough to protest. It's just sharp enough to make you aware that something is there. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. The strange thing about subtle disrespect is how easily it becomes normal, not overnight, not in obvious ways. It happens slowly, through repetition. After a while, moments that once felt unusual begin to feel expected. And when something becomes expected, people stop questioning it, including the person it's happening to. A few weeks after the shipment report incident, another Monday leadership meeting took place. By that point, the routine was predictable. Around 2 o'clock, someone from the meeting would appear at my desk with questions that could have easily been answered if I had been in the room earlier. That day, it was Caroline, one of the project managers. She walked over holding her tablet, looking slightly frustrated. "Sophia, quick thing," she said. "We're trying to figure out why the vendor escalation process takes so long." I turned slightly in my chair. "What part of the process?" I asked. "The approval chain," she said. "Daniel thinks there might be unnecessary steps." I nodded slowly. "There are," I said. Caroline blinked. "Wait, there are?" "Yes." I opened one of our internal process documents and rotated my screen so she could see. "The escalation form automatically routes through 3 approvals," I explained. "But 2 of them were added during the audit 3 years ago. They're not required anymore." Caroline stared at the screen for a moment. "So we could remove them?" "Technically, yes." "Would that cut the response time?" "By at least 2 days." For a second, she looked surprised. Then she smiled. "That's great," she said. "I'll mention it in the meeting." And with that, she walked back toward the conference room. The entire conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes. I turned back to my computer and continued working. About half an hour later, the meeting ended. People drifted out of the conference room, talking in small groups. From my desk, I overheard part of a conversation between Caroline and Daniel in the hallway. "I think we should simplify the escalation chain," Caroline was saying. Daniel looked interested. "That's actually a good idea," he replied. She nodded. "Yeah, it just adds unnecessary delay." I didn't hear the rest, but I didn't need to, because something about that moment felt familiar. Not unfair exactly, just predictable. No one had intentionally taken my idea. Caroline probably hadn't even thought about where the information came from. In her mind, she had simply discovered something useful, and Daniel likely assumed the insight had emerged naturally during the meeting. Neither of them had meant to overlook me. But they had. And strangely enough, I didn't feel angry. At least not in the way people expect when something like this happens. What I felt was quieter than that. Clarity. Because by that point, the pattern had repeated enough times that it was impossible to ignore. Ideas flowed upward, fixes flowed downward, and somewhere in between, the person quietly holding the system together remained invisible. Still, I didn't say anything. Not because I was afraid, but because part of me believed something many dependable employees eventually start believing. If I just keep doing good work, eventually someone will notice. Eventually, someone will connect the dots. Eventually, the people making decisions will realize who actually understands how everything works. It's a comforting idea, but comfort and reality don't always align. And the longer something continues without correction, the more normal it begins to feel. For everyone, including the person being overlooked. That was the phase I had entered without fully realizing it. The phase where disrespect doesn't feel shocking anymore. It just feels like part of the job. And when that happens, something subtle shifts inside you. You stop expecting recognition. You start focusing on survival. You keep the systems running. You fix what breaks. You stay reliable. But deep down, you begin watching more carefully than anyone realizes. Every workplace has roles that aren't written anywhere. Not job titles, not official responsibilities, just quiet expectations that form over time. Once those expectations settle, people begin treating them as facts. At Northbridge Logistics, my unofficial role had become very clear. I was the person who kept things running, not the person who decided how they should run. That distinction appeared in dozens of small ways. When new employees joined the department, they were introduced to me with a friendly explanation. "This is Sophia. If you ever need help figuring out how things work, she's the one to ask." It sounded flattering, but the phrasing mattered. Help figuring out how things work, not helping shape how they should work. I became the person who explained systems, located missing files, and quietly corrected problems before they reached management. When someone forgot to update a shipment status, I caught it. When two teams accidentally duplicated a process, I adjusted the documentation. When reports didn't match the raw numbers, I traced the discrepancy and fixed it. Most of the time, these corrections happened so smoothly that no one realized there had ever been an issue, which meant they also didn't realize someone had prevented it. In a way, that invisibility became my reputation. Sophia handles it. Sophia will know. Sophia will fix it. At first, I accepted that role without questioning it. After all, competence often leads to responsibility. But slowly, I noticed another pattern forming alongside it. When something needed solving, people came to me. When something needed deciding, they went somewhere else. The clearest example happened during a software transition project. Our department was considering replacing the internal tracking system with a newer platform. It was a complicated decision, one that would affect vendor communication, shipment reconciliation, and several reporting tools. The leadership team held multiple meetings about it. I wasn't in any of them. Instead, Daniel stopped by my desk one afternoon with a question. "Sophia, quick thing," he said. "Do you know which parts of the current system the reconciliation reports depend on?" I did. Not just generally, precisely. I opened my notebook, the navy leather one I'd been using for years, and showed him the dependencies. 3 modules, I explained, but 2 of them are tied to custom scripts we added after the audit. Daniel studied the page. "Huh," he said. "Good to know." He thanked me and returned to the conference room. Later that week, the department announced the decision to move forward with the new software. Within 2 days, problems began appearing. The reporting system didn't integrate with one of the vendor databases. The reconciliation script failed. And suddenly, several teams were trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Daniel came back to my desk. "Sophia, do you think these issues are connected to those scripts you mentioned?" "Yes," I said. I explained the dependencies again. This time, he listened more carefully, but even then something about the conversation stayed consistent with every other interaction we'd had. He was asking for help solving the consequences, not inviting me to shape the decision. And that was the moment I finally understood the role the office had quietly assigned to me. I wasn't the strategist. I wasn't the decision maker. I was the safety net, the person who quietly absorbed mistakes, the person who made sure the consequences didn't spiral out of control. Reliable, useful, invisible. Most people in that position eventually choose one of 2 responses. They either push aggressively to change the role, or they accept it completely. For a long time, I believed those were the only 2 options. But eventually, another possibility began to appear. A quieter one. The kind that doesn't require arguing with anyone. The kind that starts with a simple realization. If people are determined to see you as background support, you gain something they don't realize they're giving you. Freedom to observe, freedom to understand, freedom to prepare. At the time, I didn't know exactly what that preparation would lead to, but something inside me had already begun shifting. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that I started seeing the office differently. And once that perspective changes, the next step often arrives sooner than anyone expects. Most turning points don't look important when they happen. There's no music in the background, no dramatic realization where everything suddenly becomes clear. Usually, it's just a quiet moment where something small lands differently than it used to. For me, that moment happened during my annual performance review. It was late October, the kind of gray Seattle afternoon where the sky seems permanently overcast, and the office lights feel slightly too bright. Daniel had scheduled the meeting for 3 o'clock. Performance reviews at Northbridge followed a predictable format: discussion of accomplishments, areas for improvement, and potential growth within the company. I brought my usual notes: completed projects, process improvements, and documentation updates. Not because I expected anything dramatic, just because preparation had always been my habit. Daniel skimmed through the documents while I sat across from him. "Sophia," he said after a moment, "first of all, I want to say we really value your consistency." I nodded politely. "You're incredibly dependable," he continued. "When something needs to be handled correctly, we know we can count on you." That part was familiar. I had heard variations of it every year: reliable, dependable, consistent. The language of appreciation rarely changes someone's role. Daniel flipped to the next page of the evaluation. "Your operational knowledge is honestly one of the strongest in the department," he said. Another compliment. Another confirmation of something everyone already knew. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair. "But when we think about long-term leadership paths," he added, choosing his words carefully, "we're looking for a different kind of presence." I stayed quiet. He continued. "Someone who naturally drives conversations. Someone who commands attention in meetings." He folded his hands. "Sophia, you're excellent at execution, but I just don't see you as leadership material." The room stayed silent for a moment. I remember noticing something small and oddly specific: the faint humming sound from the overhead lights. I nodded. "Thank you for the feedback," I said calmly. And I meant it, not because I agreed with him, but because in that moment something inside me changed in a way I hadn't expected. For years, part of me had been waiting for recognition, waiting for someone higher in the structure to notice the patterns I saw, waiting for an opportunity to participate in decisions instead of quietly repairing them afterward. But Daniel's comment removed that expectation completely. Not harshly, not cruelly, just clearly. In his mind, and likely in the minds of several others in leadership, I had already been categorized: reliable support, not leadership. The strange thing was, once that realization settled, I didn't feel discouraged. I felt lighter. Because expectations can be a form of pressure. And once you stop expecting a system to recognize you, something interesting happens. You begin observing it more honestly. After the meeting ended, I walked back to my desk. The office was nearly empty by then. A few coworkers were finishing emails before leaving for the day. I opened my Navy notebook and added a short entry. Not emotional, just factual. Leadership perception fixed. I paused for a moment before writing the next line. Influence must take another form. At the time, that sentence didn't fully mean anything yet. It was simply an observation. But looking back, I think that was the exact moment the direction of my story changed. Not because I argued with Daniel, not because I tried to prove him wrong, but because I finally stopped trying to be seen through the lens he had already chosen. And once that effort disappeared, a different kind of thinking quietly began. After that performance review, something subtle changed in the way I moved through the office. From the outside, nothing looked different. I arrived at the same time every morning. I handled the same reports. I answered the same questions when people stopped by my desk. But internally, my relationship with the workplace had shifted. Before that conversation with Daniel, part of me had always been trying, quietly, patiently, to be recognized. Not in a loud way, just in the small ways that matter in professional environments: offering suggestions, clarifying issues, occasionally raising a concern when I saw a problem coming. I wasn't pushy about it, but the intention was there. After the review, that intention disappeared. Not out of resentment, out of clarity. If the people making decisions had already decided who counted as leadership, then there was very little value in trying to adjust their perception. And strangely, once I'd accepted that, my silence stopped feeling passive. It became deliberate. For example, a few weeks later, another operations issue appeared during the Monday leadership meeting: a discrepancy in vendor reconciliation numbers. By now, I could almost predict the sequence. The meeting would happen. The issue would surface. Someone would eventually walk over to my desk, asking how the system worked. But that morning, something slightly different happened. Evan approached my desk before the meeting. "Hey, Sophia," he said, leaning casually against the partition. "Quick question." I looked up. "What's going on?" "We're reviewing the vendor reconciliation workflow this morning," he said. "Daniel thinks the delay might be caused by the approval routing. I knew immediately what the real issue was. The reconciliation script had been patched 2 months earlier during the software transition, and one of the automated checks was now misfiring under certain conditions. It was easy to fix, 10 minutes of work. But instead of explaining all that immediately, I simply said, "That's possible." Evan nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, that's what I was thinking too." He smiled and walked toward the conference room. I returned to my report. About 40 minutes later, Caroline appeared at my desk. "Sophia," she said, sounding slightly stressed, "do you know why the reconciliation script keeps flagging vendor delays?" I explained the issue calmly. She blinked. "Wait, that's it?" "Yes." She looked relieved. "That makes everything much easier." She hurried back to the meeting. The sequence had played out exactly the same as always, except for one difference. I hadn't volunteered the answer beforehand. Not because I wanted anyone to struggle, but because I had started noticing something important about how the office worked. People didn't value solutions that they never participated in discovering. If I offered answers too early, they disappeared into the background. If the problem surfaced first, suddenly the solution mattered. This wasn't manipulation. It was simply an observation. Over the next few weeks, my behavior became slightly more selective. I still helped when someone asked. I still corrected errors that would cause serious problems. But I stopped inserting myself into conversations where my input wasn't requested. I stopped sending proactive emails explaining potential issues before meetings happen. And almost immediately, something interesting occurred. The leadership team began encountering more questions during their discussions. Nothing catastrophic, just small uncertainties that slowed conversations down, and gradually a new phrase began circulating more often in the department. "Let's check with Sophia." It appeared in meetings, in hallway conversations, in email threads. At first, it sounded casual, but over time, I noticed something subtle in the tone when people said it. Not just convenience, dependence. Because when silence becomes a choice, people start realizing how much they relied on the things you used to say automatically. I didn't point this out. I didn't mention it to anyone. I simply continued doing my work, observing, learning, and documenting something most of the department still hadn't realized. Exactly how much of the system quietly flowed through one place: my desk and my notebook. The longer you stay quiet in a place where people assume you're simply support, the more invisible your movements become. And invisibility, if you know how to use it, can be a very powerful position. After my performance review, and after I began choosing silence more carefully, my daily routine looked almost identical to before. Same desk, same reports, same polite conversations in the hallway, but there was something happening behind the surface of that routine that no one noticed. I was learning the system in a different way. Before, I had understood how everything worked. Now, I started documenting why everything worked. Every morning, when I opened my navy leather notebook, I added something new. No complaints, not emotional reactions, just patterns. Which teams depended on which vendor data feeds? Which reports were technically automated, but actually required manual corrections that only a few people knew how to perform? Which approval chains existed only because no one had bothered to remove them after past audits? The more I wrote down, the clearer the structure of the department became. And with clarity comes something valuable: perspective. For example, I realized something interesting about our shipment reconciliation process. Technically, the system belonged to the IT department, but the actual workflow, the one that kept numbers consistent between vendors, finance, and operations, depended on a series of small, undocumented adjustments that had accumulated over the years. Some had been created by former employees, some during crisis situations, some during software migrations, and almost none of them existed in official documentation, but they all passed through the same place: my desk. Not because anyone had designed it that way, simply because, over time, when something needed fixing, people had asked me, and I had fixed it, which meant that by now I had something unusual: a working map of how the department truly functioned. Not the version written in company manuals, the real one. At the same time, something else began happening in the office. As I stopped offering solutions before meetings, more problems began surfacing during those meetings. Again, nothing catastrophic, just moments of confusion. Questions like, why is this report delayed? Who actually manages this approval step? Why does this process take 3 days longer than it should? Eventually, someone would say the now familiar phrase, "Let's ask Sophia." Sometimes they asked immediately, sometimes hours later. Either way, I answered calmly, always factual, always concise. But after each interaction, I returned to my notebook and added another observation, not about people, about systems. Because the more I watched, the clearer something became. Our department wasn't fragile because people were incompetent. Most of them were smart, hardworking, capable. The fragility came from something else. Fragmentation. Everyone understood their piece of the system. Very few people understood how those pieces connected. And connections were where the real leverage lived. One afternoon, while reviewing vendor response times, I noticed something that made me pause. 3 different teams, operations, vendor management, and finance, were all relying on slightly different versions of the same data pipeline. Each version had been adjusted separately over time, which meant that if one part of the pipeline stopped working, several departments would lose visibility into shipment status simultaneously, not immediately, but within about 24 hours. I studied the workflow for a while. The more I examined it, the clearer the dependency became. And something else became clear too. Very few people in leadership were aware that this vulnerability existed. Not Daniel, not Caroline, not even the IT team manages the infrastructure. Because technically the system was functioning. The problem only appeared if a specific sequence of events occurred, the kind of sequence that rarely happened. But when it did, the consequences would spread quickly. I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. Critical dependency, reconciliation pipeline, visibility gap. Then I closed the notebook and returned to work. At that moment, I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't waiting for something to fail. I was simply documenting reality. But the interesting thing about understanding systems deeply enough is that eventually you start recognizing where pressure points exist, not as weapons, as truths. And truths have a strange quality. Most people ignore them, right up until the moment they suddenly matter. There's a difference between suspecting something about a system and confirming it. For weeks after noticing the reconciliation pipeline dependency, I didn't do anything dramatic with that information. I simply observed. In most companies, systems look stable from the outside. Reports generate, emails flow, meetings happen, numbers move through dashboards. But stability in large organizations often depends on invisible habits, small manual corrections, and quiet adjustments that people perform without thinking about them. If those habits disappear, the system doesn't fail immediately. It just slowly loses clarity. One Thursday afternoon, that thought led me to run a small test. Nothing disruptive, nothing unethical, just verification. I opened 3 internal dashboards used by different teams: operations, vendor management, and finance. All 3 relied on shipment status data, and all 3 pulled that data from slightly different stages of the reconciliation pipeline. At first glance, the numbers looked aligned. But when I traced them back through the underlying process logs, the differences became visible. One dashboard depended on the nightly script. Another depended on a corrected export that I usually verified manually. And the finance dashboard relied on a summary report built 2 steps later. Individually, none of those pieces was fragile. But together, they formed a chain. And that chain had quite a weak point. If the reconciliation script stopped processing correctly, even briefly, the downstream dashboards would continue displaying stale data for several hours before anyone noticed. Not because the system was broken, because the warning signs were subtle. The first people to see the discrepancy would almost certainly be the person reviewing the raw reconciliation logs, which happened to be me. I leaned back slightly in my chair and stared at the screens. For a long moment, I didn't write anything. Because something about that realization wasn't just technical, it was structural. The department's leadership believed they had full operational visibility, but that visibility depended on a chain of corrections that no one had formally documented. Corrections I had been quietly performing for years. Without those adjustments, the dashboards people trusted during meetings would gradually drift away from reality. Not immediately, but quickly enough to cause confusion. I didn't feel excitement when I understood that. I felt calm because leverage, when it's real, doesn't create drama. It creates clarity. I opened my notebook and wrote another entry. Operational visibility depends on reconciliation oversight. Then I paused. Not to celebrate the discovery, to think. For years, I had believed that if leadership truly understood how much invisible work supported their decisions, they might invite me into those conversations. But Daniel's performance review had already answered that question. Recognition wasn't coming, not because my work lacked value, because the system had already decided where that value belonged, behind the scenes, support, execution, not leadership. I closed the notebook. And that's when something interesting happened internally. For the first time, I stopped viewing my knowledge as something waiting to be recognized. I started viewing it as something that simply existed, independent of anyone's perception. Most people think power in organizations comes from titles. Sometimes it does. But there's another kind of influence that rarely gets discussed. The kind that comes from understanding the system more completely than the people directing it. Not in an arrogant way, just factually. And once that realization settles, a new question naturally follows. Not, how do I prove myself? But something quieter. What do I want to do with what I know? At that moment, I still hadn't made any decisions. I continued answering questions when coworkers asked. I continued maintaining the systems. I continued writing observations in my notebook. From the outside, nothing about my role had changed. But privately, something had become very clear. If a serious disruption ever hit the department, the kind of disruption that interrupted the reconciliation pipeline, the leadership team would suddenly realize how much they didn't understand about the systems they depended on. And when that moment arrived, they would almost certainly look in the same direction they always had when something complicated needed fixing. My desk. What none of them realized yet was that by then, I would already understand the situation more clearly than anyone in the room. Understanding a system gives you perspective. But perspective alone doesn't change anything. At some point, a moment arrives when observation quietly turns into choice. For me, that moment didn't appear because I wanted it to. It appeared because the department began preparing for a major operational update. Northbridge Logistics had been expanding its vendor network for months. More shipments, more suppliers, more regional partners. From the outside, the growth looked impressive. Inside the operations floor, it meant something simpler, more pressure on the systems that already existed. One Tuesday morning, Daniel gathered several team leads for a discussion about scaling the reconciliation process. I wasn't invited to that meeting. But later that afternoon, the questions began arriving at my desk. First, Caroline. Sophia, do you know if the reconciliation script can handle double the vendor traffic? Then Evan. Daniel's wondering if the reporting pipeline has any bottlenecks. Then a message in my inbox from the finance team. Can you confirm that the nightly processing schedule won't conflict with expanded vendor feeds? Each question touched the same underlying issue, capacity. And I knew the honest answer. The system could probably handle the increased load most of the time, but under certain conditions, heavy vendor traffic combined with delayed script execution, the reconciliation pipeline could stall. Not completely, just enough to create data gaps across multiple dashboards. Those gaps wouldn't be immediately obvious. They would appear gradually, first as delayed reports, then as inconsistent shipment visibility. Eventually, entire teams would be working with incomplete information. The leadership group discussing expansion in the conference room almost certainly believed the system was stable enough to support growth. But their understanding depended on something they didn't realize existed, my quiet oversight. For years, I had been manually correcting small irregularities that prevented those gaps from spreading. The leadership team had never needed to think about them, because I handled them before they became visible. That afternoon, as the questions arrived one by one, I felt something unfamiliar. Not frustration, not resentment, just a very clear awareness that I was standing at a crossroads. There were several options available to me. Option 1 was the path I had followed for years: explain everything in advance, detail every dependency, make sure leadership fully understands the system before making their decision. That approach would protect the department, but it would also reinforce the role they had already assigned to me: invisible support. Option 2 was more aggressive: demand involvement in the decision-making process, push back against Daniel's earlier assessment, insist that operational knowledge deserves a voice in leadership discussions. Some people choose that route, sometimes it works, but it also creates friction, and friction often shifts the conversation away from systems toward personalities. There was a third option: quieter, irreversible in its own way. Continue doing my job, answer questions when asked, Correct problems when they appear, but stop protecting leadership from the consequences of decisions made without full understanding. Not sabotage, not withholding information, simply allowing the system to reveal its true complexity when the pressure increased. The department would still function, but the illusion of complete visibility would eventually disappear. And when that happened, the leadership team would be forced to confront a question they had never seriously considered. Who actually understood the system well enough to restore order? I sat at my desk for a long moment before responding to the messages in my inbox. My replies were clear, accurate, and carefully limited to the specific questions that had been asked. No warnings, no extra analysis, just facts. Then I closed the email window and opened my notebook. On a fresh page, I wrote a single line. Support when asked, do not anticipate. I didn't feel dramatic when I wrote it, just certain. Because sometimes the most decisive choice a person makes isn't loud at all. It's simply the moment they stop preventing other people from experiencing the consequences of their own assumptions. After that decision, nothing about my behavior looked unusual. If someone had watched my daily routine, they would have seen the same person they had always seen. I still arrived early, I still reviewed shipment reconciliation logs, I still answered questions calmly when coworkers stopped by my desk, but internally, my approach had shifted in a way no one else could see. Before, I had been quietly preventing future problems. Now I focused only on the problems that actually existed. It's a subtle difference, but in complex systems, it changes everything. For example, in the past, I would occasionally send proactive messages when I noticed a pattern forming. Something like, just a heads up, the reconciliation script may need adjustment if vendor volume increases. Or, finance reports could lag if the nightly pipeline runs longer than expected. Those emails had always been well-intentioned. I believed that if people understood potential risks early, they could avoid unnecessary complications later. But after the expansion discussions began, I stopped sending them. Not out of secrecy, simply because no one had asked for that level of analysis. And my new rule was very simple. Support when asked. Do not anticipate. The department continued preparing for vendor expansion. More contracts were signed. More shipment routes were added. Operations dashboards slowly began reflecting higher traffic levels. During meetings, the leadership team seemed confident about the transition. From what I overheard in hallway conversations, the general belief was that the infrastructure had plenty of capacity, and technically, that belief wasn't completely wrong. Most days, the system handled the increased volume just fine, but every complex workflow has thresholds. Moments where efficiency begins to strain. Moments where small delays cascade into larger ones. I started noticing the first signs of those thresholds about 2 weeks into the expansion. Nothing dramatic. The reconciliation script took slightly longer to finish. A few vendor updates appeared later than usual. One morning, Caroline mentioned that a shipment status report had taken longer to generate. Probably just the higher volume, she said casually. I nodded. Most likely. In the past, that would have been the moment I explained exactly how the increased load interacted with the nightly pipeline. Now, I simply noted the observation, because the system was still functioning. And according to my rule, anticipation was no longer my responsibility. Meanwhile, I continued doing something I had been doing for months, documenting. Every time a report finished later than usual, every time a vendor update arrived out of sequence, every time a dashboard displayed numbers that required manual verification, none of those moments caused immediate problems. But together, they painted a picture. A system is gradually approaching a pressure point. One afternoon, I opened my notebook and flipped back through several pages of observations. Patterns had begun forming, processing delays, script retries, dashboard refresh inconsistencies, all are small enough to ignore individually, but connected in a way that suggested something inevitable. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. I closed the notebook and looked across the operations floor. Daniel was speaking with Evan near the conference room. Caroline was reviewing vendor reports at her desk. The office looked exactly as it always had, calm, organized, efficient. Most of the department believed the expansion was going smoothly. From a certain perspective, it was. But systems rarely fail all at once. They reveal their limits gradually. A missed update here, a delayed report there, until eventually one small disruption arrives at exactly the wrong moment. And suddenly, everyone realizes the structure they trusted was more fragile than it appeared. I didn't know exactly when that moment would arrive, but I knew something else with complete certainty. When it did, the leadership team would start asking questions. And just like every other time a complicated problem appeared, those questions would travel through the department in the same direction, quietly, until they reached the one place that had always understood how everything connected: my desk. The first sign that something had changed didn't come with alarms or urgent emails. It came with confusion. On a Tuesday morning, about a month after the vendor expansion began, I arrived at the office and opened the reconciliation dashboard the way I always did. At first glance, everything looked normal. Shipments were being processed, vendor feeds were updating, the nightly script had completed. But as I checked the detailed logs, I noticed a small irregularity. The reconciliation script had retried twice during the night before completing successfully. That wasn't catastrophic, but it was unusual. Retries meant the system had briefly struggled to process the incoming volume. I made a short note in my notebook and continued reviewing the data. About an hour later, the first question arrived. Caroline appeared beside my desk, holding a tablet. "Sophia, quick question," she said. "Do you know why the vendor status dashboard is showing shipments that already cleared yesterday?" I checked the dashboard she showed me. The data wasn't wrong. It was simply delayed. The reconciliation pipeline ran slower overnight, I explained. The vendor feed probably updated before the corrected export finished. Caroline frowned slightly. "So the dashboard's behind?" "Temporarily," she nodded. "Okay, thanks." She walked away. Again, nothing dramatic. Just a small inconvenience. But about 30 minutes later, another message appeared in my inbox. This one is from the finance team. Subject: Shipment totals mismatch. "Hi, Sophia. The operations dashboard shows a different shipment count than the finance summary. Do you know why?" I checked both reports. Same situation. The reconciliation script had completed, but the downstream dashboards hadn't refreshed in the usual sequence. The numbers would eventually align, but for a few hours, the department was looking at slightly different versions of the same reality. I replied with a brief explanation. Then I returned to my work. Around midday, the operations floor began feeling slightly more active than usual. Not frantic, just unsettled. I overheard fragments of conversations. "Did the vendor report refresh yet?" "Finance says their numbers don't match." Daniel's asking where the discrepancy is coming from. Eventually, Evan walked over to my desk. "Sophia," he said, sounding thoughtful, "do you know why the shipment dashboards aren't lining up today?" I explained the pipeline delay again. He nodded slowly. "So it's just processing time?" "For now," I said. He thanked me and headed toward the conference room. A few minutes later, I saw Daniel step out of that room and scan the operations floor. His expression wasn't worried exactly, but he was clearly trying to understand something. He walked toward my desk. "Sophia," he said, "I'm hearing that several dashboards are showing different shipment numbers." "That's correct," I said. "Why?" I explained the sequence calmly. Script retries, pipeline delay, staggered dashboard refresh. Daniel listened carefully. "So everything will eventually sync up?" he asked. "Yes," he nodded. "Okay, good." Then he paused. "How often does this happen?" I considered the question for a moment. Before the expansion, the answer would have been simple: almost never. But things had changed. "It's becoming more common with the higher vendor volume," I said. Daniel looked thoughtful. For a second, it seemed like he might ask another question, something deeper about how the system worked. But instead he simply said, "Thanks, Sophia." Then he walked back toward the conference room. From my desk, I watched the door close behind him. Inside, the leadership team would almost certainly continue discussing the shipment discrepancies, trying to understand why the dashboards weren't aligning the way they expected. The interesting thing was this: nothing in the department had actually broken. The system was still running. Shipments were still moving. Reports were still generating. But something subtle had begun to shift. For the first time since the expansion began, leadership was experiencing the limits of the system they believed they fully understood. And limits have a way of revealing themselves gradually, first as an inconvenience, then as uncertainty, eventually as dependency. Because once people realize the tools they trust aren't giving them clear answers, they start looking for someone who can. And in our department, that search always followed the same quiet path: through the operations floor, past the conference room, until it arrived at the same place it had arrived countless times before: my desk. The real problem didn't appear all at once. It arrived the way most system failures do, through accumulation. Over the next few days, the small inconsistencies that had started appearing became more noticeable across the department. Dashboards are refreshed at slightly different times. Vendor updates lagged behind shipment confirmations. Finance reports occasionally showed totals that operations hadn't seen yet. Individually, none of these issues stopped the department from working. But together, they created something far more uncomfortable: uncertainty. One afternoon, the operations floor felt different than usual. Conversations were happening more quickly, voices slightly sharper than normal. Caroline walked past my desk twice within 10 minutes, reviewing shipment logs. Evan was speaking with someone from IT near the conference room. And inside that room, Daniel had gathered several team leads again. About 15 minutes later, my inbox filled with messages. Do you know why the shipment totals are still off? Is the reconciliation script stuck again? Can you check the vendor pipeline? I answered each message calmly. The system was still processing. The delays were connected to increased traffic and script retries. Eventually, the numbers would align. But by now, the leadership team had noticed something unsettling. The answers were no longer immediate. At one point, Daniel stepped out of the conference room and came directly toward my desk. "Sophia," he said, keeping his voice steady, "how long before the dashboards sync again?" "Probably a few hours," I said. He nodded slowly. "And this is happening because of the expansion volume?" "That's one of the factors." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a question he had never asked before. "Is there something about the system we didn't account for?" I looked at the dashboards again. Technically, there were several things: dependencies, manual checks, processing thresholds, but those were structural realities that had existed for years. They weren't new. What was new was that leadership was finally seeing the system without the quiet corrections that had always smoothed its edges. "The system is complex," I said carefully. "Higher volume exposes more of that complexity." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Right." He returned to the conference room. From my desk, I could hear the muffled rhythm of conversation inside. People are trying to understand something they thought they already understood. The difficult part was this: by the time leadership begins asking deeper questions during a disruption, the system is already under pressure. Changes can still be made. Adjustments can still happen. But they no longer feel proactive. They feel reactive. And reactive decisions rarely restore the kind of calm confidence that existed before the cracks became visible. Because once uncertainty enters a system people thought they controlled, it's very hard to pretend it isn't there. The conversation happened late that afternoon. By then, the operations floor had grown quieter. Most people were still working, but the usual casual rhythm of the office had shifted. Conversations were shorter. People were watching their dashboards more closely. Around 4 o'clock, Daniel walked over to my desk. "Sophia, do you have a minute?" "Of course," I said. We stepped into a small meeting room near the end of the hallway. The same kind of room where dozens of ordinary conversations had happened over the years. Daniel closed the door behind us and sat across from me. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he said calmly, "I think we underestimated how dependent some of our processes are on the reconciliation pipeline." I nodded slightly. "It's a central piece of the system." He looked at me carefully. "How long have you known that the increased volume might create these delays?" The question wasn't accusatory, just direct. "For a while," I said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I wish we discussed it earlier." His tone carried more reflection than frustration. I met his gaze calmly. "The expansion discussions happen mostly in leadership meetings," I said. "I wasn't part of those." That wasn't criticism, just a fact. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if something had clicked into place. "Fair point," he said. The room stayed silent for a few seconds. Finally, he asked the question that mattered most now. "Can we stabilize the system?" "Yes," I said. "How?" I explained the steps simply: adjusting the reconciliation schedule, restructuring part of the pipeline, and aligning the dashboards so they refreshed from the same verified dataset. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of structural clarity that comes from understanding how everything connects. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded again. "We'll implement that," he said. Then he paused before adding something quieter. "Sophia, I think we should have been involving you in these conversations earlier." I didn't react emotionally. There was no point, because the moment wasn't about recognition. It was about understanding. Maybe, I said gently. We stood, opened the door, and walked back onto the operations floor. No one noticed the conversation, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. Not loudly, just enough that the structure of the department was beginning to look slightly different from what it had that morning. The system stabilized within the next few days. The reconciliation schedule was adjusted. The dashboards were aligned to the same verified dataset. Vendor traffic continued increasing, but now the pipeline handled it more predictably. From the outside, the department returned to something that looked normal. Shipments moved, reports generated, meetings resumed their usual rhythm. But something subtle had changed. Not in the systems, in the way people looked at them. During the following Monday meeting, I was asked to join the discussion for the first time. There was no announcement, no formal explanation. Daniel simply stopped by my desk earlier that morning. Sophia, we're reviewing the updated reconciliation process today, he said. It would be helpful if you were in the room. I nodded. When I entered the conference room, the atmosphere felt slightly different from how it used to be. Not dramatic, just attentive. People asked more questions about how the system actually worked. They paused longer when discussing changes. They checked assumptions before moving forward, and occasionally someone would turn toward me and ask, Sophia, does that dependency affect anything else? I answered the same way I always had, calmly, clearly, without needing to prove anything. Because by then, the dynamic had already shifted. Not because I argued for recognition, not because I forced my way into leadership conversations, but because the system itself had revealed something. Understanding has weight, and once people realize who truly understands how things function, they start listening differently. My job title didn't change overnight. My desk was still in the same place on the operations floor, but the role people saw when they looked at me was no longer exactly the same. Not invisible support, not just reliability, something closer to quiet authority. And strangely, I didn't feel the need to claim it, because the most stable form of influence isn't something you announce. It's something that becomes obvious once people finally see the structure clearly. For years, I had been the person quietly keeping the system running. Now, I was simply doing the same work without needing anyone to overlook it anymore. Looking back, the most interesting part of this experience isn't the crisis itself. Systems fail, departments make mistakes, workplaces adjust. That happens everywhere. What stayed with me was something quieter. For years, I believed recognition would eventually come from being patient, competent, and dependable. I assumed that if people saw enough good work, they would naturally start inviting me into bigger conversations. Sometimes that happens, but often organizations don't change until reality forces them to see what was already there. The truth is, I didn't win an argument. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't need to prove Daniel wrong. The system simply reached a moment where understanding became more valuable than titles. And when that happened, the people who needed answers naturally turned toward the person who had been studying the structure all along. What I learned from that experience is something I still carry today. Being underestimated can feel frustrating, but it also gives you a rare opportunity. When people assume you're just background support, they stop paying attention to how deeply you're actually learning the system. They overlook the quiet preparation. They overlook the patterns you notice. And eventually, when something important happens, that preparation speaks for itself. Not loudly, just clearly. So if you've ever been in a place where people saw you as reliable but not influential, invisible but necessary, I understand that feeling very well. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't to fight the role people assign you. Sometimes it's too quiet to master the system they forgot to look at closely. Because when the moment finally arrives, clarity tends to speak louder than any title. I'm curious about your experience. Have you ever been underestimated at work and later found yourself becoming the person everyone suddenly depended on?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.